Kingdom of Men, Chapter 11, Lies. The rest of the day passed by in a blur for KaLeah. Princess Amira was required to be present while the men prepared to invade and conquer Exteli Kingdom. She had to bid her father, brother, and the Bellarone soldiers farewell and wish them a quick victory. KaLeah was glad that she only had to stand quietly behind the princess and listen to her repeat, "Farewell and quick victory," over and over to each soldier that passed by. KaLeah had changed into a dark gray tunic over black tights, and she had her long brown hair pulled back, hiding like a shadow behind Amira's fluffy, bright violet and gold dress. She hoped to be as invisible as possible. They stood beside Prince Bilex in the courtyard, overlooking the servants and soldiers preparing dragons and carriages for the 7 days' journey to the coastal region. KaLeah could see Prince Nicolot and King Arazus inspecting the work nearest to the castle while doling out orders. Ranks of soldiers and their captains were gathering on the fields. The king and Prince Nicolot were dressed in the finest of uniforms, with white, long-sleeved tunics, red breast and wrist guards, white pants tucked into black boots, and the Bellarone dragon emblem emblazoned on their chests. They looked regal and determined from where she stood. Nicolot was off to rule his very own kingdom. How proud they must both be, KaLeah thought. Prince Bilex was dressed just as well, in a long red cape pinned together with an elegantly carved silver dragon encircling a ball of fire on his chest. He appeared indifferent, but a few beads of sweat on his neck in the cool afternoon breeze betrayed nervousness, since the day was not yet warm. KaLeah realized that she really knew nothing of this man who was about to be left in charge for an unknown amount of time. Amira smiled as she watched the activities taking place below her and received each soldier's bow kindly. KaLeah sneered, though, thinking how sad that all the young princess was good for was giving birth to more favors, who may one day be bred back into the royal family. And what of her own fate? At least she would never love again, that much was certain. Whether she managed to escape the grasp of Bellarone Kingdom or not, she would never let her heart be captured. Without a father, without a husband, KaLeah was freer than Princess Amira would ever be. An involuntary sigh left her lips as her glance left Princess Amira and slid back over to Prince Nicolot. Nick never once looked at either of them. Staring him down, her heart beat harder in her chest. She was angry but also embarrassed about her emotional display in the library. Her sadness about the finality of his pending departure and how he had not seemed to care even a little bit about how she felt tamped down her anger some. "I'm sure he's upset about having to leave his home so quickly," she thought. "I am sure that I am the least of his concerns. The man is going to war, going to take over and rule a completely different kingdom. He could not possibly have time to think about me, or any declaration of love, or my plan to trade one form of imprisonment for another." KaLeah raised her palm to her forehead, hiding her eyes. "What an idiot," she said to herself as she tapped her hand to her head and squeezed her eyes shut tight. "Good afternoon, favor KaLeah." The voice was a soft whisper, but KaLeah jumped at the sudden interruption to her self-loathing thoughts. "Captain Davin, you startled me," she said. Hillip was standing beside her, and she wondered if he'd seen her tapping her forehead. He smiled an apology, and she couldn't help but smile back at him. He emitted such a kind, peaceful presence, so much different from Nicolot, that she couldn't help but like him. "Are you and your men prepared to leave?" she asked, making polite conversation. "I am actually remaining here, along with one other captain and our men. Given the recent events, we do not want to leave the kingdom exposed." "Oh, yes, of course," she said, trying to hide her mixed emotions with a nod and smile. "I'm glad for your protection." She was glad that they would have protection, but she knew that if the captain and scores of other soldiers were hanging around the grounds, KaLeah would have to plan her escape even more carefully. She wondered if Hilip would be completely full of disappointment for her today. "Any word of my father?" "I'm sorry, KaLeah," Hilip said. "No one in the center or surrounding villages have seen or heard of anyone named Clegg Trapper, but we will continue to look, I promise." Her heart sank further down into her stomach. No father, no prince, no way to sneak away with so many guards and soldiers staying behind. I should have left the princess to find her own way home after killing her kidnappers, she thought. The thought filled her with guilt, but she knew if she hadn't been so heroic, she wouldn't be trapped here now. "Are you all right, KaLeah?" Hilip placed his hand softly on her shoulder. Her eyes widened in surprise from the contact, and he quickly removed his hand. "Sorry," he said, looking down as if his hand had betrayed him. "That's fine. I'm fine." She turned in time to see Nicolot looking up at her, a mixture of anger and possession in his eyes. Had he seen Hilip touch me? Her eyes stung in happiness at the thought of his potential jealousy, even though it would do her no good. Captain Davin made no more attempts to touch or speak to her. KaLeah, Amira, Bilex, the captain, and a few favors and soldiers stood and watched the Legion make its final preparations. KaLeah hoped that Nicolot would turn around. She pictured him running to her and begging her to join him. She stood watching with the others. They watched the Legion march out of the castle. Nicolot never looked back. Days passed uneventfully in the castle. KaLeah spent her time teaching the princess how to sword fight and reading in the library, while Amira received her arithmetic, history, and geography lessons. KaLeah had completed her schooling back in Arion, so she continued to educate herself simply by reading various historic books in her free time. She found that by getting lost in the old stories, the details, visualizing the lands and events, she forgot about being locked up. She forgot about how her life had been stolen from her for a few hours. The pain and anger melted away when she was living in someone else's story. KaLeah realized that she had seen Captain Davin more times in the last few days than she had seen of him the entire time she'd been at Bellerone Castle. He was at all their meals. He came to observe during her drills with Amira. He always seemed to be wandering the halls just outside the library or outside of their suites. He would appear out of nowhere, as if locked onto her schedule, and politely ask to escort her. In the evenings, after Amira was in bed, Hilip would teach KaLeah various pathways through the secret tunnels, step by step, forcing her to remember her way around in the darkness until she began to catch onto a natural pattern. She partly wondered if he had been ordered to keep an extra close eye on her and Amira, to make sure they stayed indoors and stuck to the rules and schedules laid out for them. But there was something awkward in his constant presence. His smile stayed too long on his face after they laughed about something together. His eyes seemed to linger on her own when they spoke. She told herself that he was only around because he had been ordered to keep watch over them. Although she was the princess's bodyguard, KaLeah had gotten into enough trouble to warrant an extra eye. She shrugged off the extra attention as nothing more than a requirement, another form of imprisonment for her to bear. She especially loathed when he gave her excuses about his men's inability to locate her father. However, with the castle quieter than normal, and without her obsession with Nicolot to keep her company, she started to feel a bit of comfort, knowing he was just around the corner, knowing he would be escorting them to the library, after she and Amira cleaned up after practice, and knowing that he would keep them company during mealtimes. Late one afternoon, KaLeah was reading comfortably in an oversized chair in the front area of the library, while Amira studied with a tutor in another area further back. The book was a historic account of how the three kingdoms on Naldash were formed. The rulers, though ancestors of the founding families, did not all have the kingdom's names. They took the formal kingdom's name upon ordainment. Bellarone was the first kingdom founded by the Bellarone family, led by a fearsome tribe warrior. Apparently merciless, Riken Bellarone made himself king and took charge of various tribes living in the area through the enforcement of other warriors loyal to him. Two tribes refused to fall under his command, rebelled against the Bellarone fighters, and after both sides suffered numerous casualties, the tribes had enough of a reprieve to escape the lands. One escaped tribe was led by Gorgola Exteli, who took his people west until they hit rocky shores. They became fishermen and mined the cliffs for metals and jewels. When he heard that Riken Bellarone had declared himself king, Gorgola created the Extellan kingdom and named himself king. The second tribe was led by Locholin Lysodania. Similarly, he helped his people escape, but to the southeast, where the lands were more fertile, like Bellarone lands. There they spread out farms as far as the eye could see. Since there were plenty of grasslands and no mountains, they enjoyed much easier winters but harsher summers, with larger storms rolling down upon them from the North Mountains. It wasn't until Locholin passed away many years later that one of his sons, Decalin Lysodania, declared himself king, in order to prevent Bellarone and Exteli from trying to claim their lands and people for themselves. Decalin established a great army to ensure a constant defensive at the ready, while opening peaceful trade with Bellarone. As the generations passed, the three kingdoms managed to keep the peace, trading marriages from time to time. If there came a time when there was a lack of an heir, a member of a favor family would be married into the royal family, but the royal name would be maintained. KaLeah closed the book and leaned back in her chair. She had never had access to so much information, and she was glad to read and be distracted from her thoughts of Nicolot. She heard loud steps in the hallway and looked toward the door. A young soldier burst into the library, calling out her name. She sat up so fast that the book flew down to the ground with a loud boom. "Favor KaLeah, Captain Davin sent me. They have captured your father. He is in the throne room." "Captured?" she asked. Forgetting about the princess, KaLeah quickly scrambled out of the chair and followed him through the door. They ran down the hallways, and she peppered him with questions along the way. "What do you mean, captured? Is he all right? Who captured him? What's happening?" He didn't answer any of her questions, so she finally stopped asking. She ran into the throne room, stopping suddenly when she saw her father. He looked so small, standing between two soldiers with his hands tied behind his back. Each soldier had a hand on one of his shoulders, and they stood about 20 steps away from Prince Bilex, who was sitting on his father's massive throne, his arms resting on the carved dragon heads, the red velvet oval of the chair back clashing with his informal attire. He had clearly been pulled here from doing something relaxing like a bath. Bilex's hair was disheveled, and he wore an oversized yellow gold robe. KaLeah still wasn't used to seeing him on the throne. Captain Davin stood beside him. "Father!" KaLeah yelled, and everyone turned toward her. She ran to Clegg Trapper, sidestepped a soldier, and threw her arms around her missing father's neck. The soldiers stepped slightly back, but kept firm hands on the man's shoulders. She released him immediately, not being used to hugging her father. She was surprised by her own display of emotion and felt suddenly awkward. She was relieved to see him, but concerned about his restraints. "KaLeah?" Clegg asked, his face scrunching in puzzlement. "You're alive," she said. "I was so worried. Where have you been? Why are you bound?" Then she turned to the soldiers, and realizing they wouldn't answer, she turned to address Hillip. "Why is my father bound?" Captain Davin stepped down from the dais. The man seemed distinctively different from the young soldier who had been following her around the castle for days. He seemed more serious and sterner than she'd ever seen him before. "Favor KaLeah, your father was found wandering the fields of Bellerone and carrying a strange weapon. He was brought in and bound as any spy or Extellan would be. We have to be extra cautious in times of war." "Well, he isn't a spy. He's my father from Arion Village." She looked back at her father and noticed how dirty he was. His face and hair were almost a shade darker. His beard was grown out longer and was unkempt. His pants below the knees were caked in mud. She placed her hand on his chest. "What happened to you?" "I'm not a spy. I wasn't even aware that there was a war going on," Clegg said, looking past KaLeah to speak to the captain directly. "Don't touch that!" KaLeah spun around to see who her father had yelled at. The young soldier who had escorted her to the throne room was now standing opposite Captain Davin in front of the dais. He was holding out a black, metallic object that looked familiar. KaLeah realized that it looked like the strange objects she had found hidden beneath their house in Arion. He glanced slightly up at her father and then back down, turning the black object over in his hand. "That thing is a very dangerous weapon," he warned loudly. "Son, you must be careful. Please, set it down gently." Chills trickled down her back. She had been right. They had been weapons, but like nothing she had ever known or trained with. Why would her father train her with swords, knives, bows, and arrows, but not these? Why had they been hidden? Prince Bilek stood up and took a step down from his father's throne. He looked awkward in what she assumed was a bathrobe, but he didn't seem to care. His eyes were squinted with curious fascination. "How is that you have come by such strange weapons, and then come into Bellerone Kingdom with them?" he asked. "The guns," Clegg started. He looked at KaLeah, then to the captain, and back to the prince. He seemed to be hesitating. "That weapon is not of this world, Your Majesty. We don't have weapons like this on Naldash. I can assure you that I do not intend to do harm with it, but that it is indeed dangerous and should be handled with the utmost care." Clegg's eyes finally rested on hers, as if there was much more to say than he knew where to begin, but instead he looked past her again to the man holding the weapon. "The gun is made of metal and uses fire to project a bullet." "Let me see this gun," Bilek said, holding out his hand toward the soldier. "Your Majesty, I highly advise against." But his warning came too late. The man who handed the gun to Bilek set it off. The room was filled with a noise unlike anything KaLeah had ever heard. It was as if thunder had entered the room. KaLeah watched a golden flame spread throughout the prince's skin. His eyes went wide and he fell back. Captain Davin and a handful of soldiers ran to Bilex. "He's still breathing. Get the nurses. Get something to stop the bleeding. Do not touch that weapon. Take the prisoners to the dungeon." "Prisoners?" KaLeah's arms were grabbed and bound in front of her, and then she and her father were dragged from the room. It took KaLeah far too long to catch her breath, draw it in, and then formulate words. "Captain!" she finally called from the threshold. "Hillip!" But no one was paying her any mind except for the soldiers pulling her away from the chaos. While she and her father were being hauled out into the hallway, she saw Princess Amira run into the throne room from another entrance. Her shrill scream filled the air. KaLeah closed her eyes tightly, knowing the scene that the young girl had just stumbled onto. She would be a changed girl after this. Her heart ached with guilt for not being there to pull Amira away, to console her. Her reunion with her father had turned into a nightmare for them all. Voices crept in and out between her thoughts, voices that she was beginning to realize did not belong to her. They were angry, indiscernible whispers and guttural growls. She tried to shake them out of her head, causing the soldier holding her to tug her harder. The halls seemed to get tighter and darker the further down into the castle's interior they went. KaLeah tried to count the steps between candle sconces, and sure enough, the distance, even between the lights, was growing, creating deeper chasms of darkness along their path. With every step, the walls leaned in a little more and squeezed the two captives closer together. She started to wonder about air and how she and her father would be able to breathe. At least the candles were still flickering, she thought. The air in the depths of the castle was old and stale, and she imagined the putrid damp air to be thick with spirits who, with every breath she took, were trying to invade her lungs as the voices invaded her mind. She had always enjoyed darkness and solitude, but she knew that the holding cells in the dungeon would contain a different kind of darkness and loneliness. There, she would have no control. There, she would not have a way out. KaLeah tried to remain calm, clear-headed, and silent. Water was dripping somewhere in the dark, falling onto stone and filling up small pools of water at their feet. They descended a narrow, uneven staircase, and then the room opened to reveal rows and rows of iron cages, the metal twinkling in the light from at least 100 candles. It was an underground world with a high ceiling, pools of black water, and no guards visibly attending to the war captives KaLeah could hear mumbling and yelling from within their cells. It must have been the very bottom of the castle, exactly as Amira had once named it. "Put us together, and far away from the other prisoners," KaLeah heard herself say without thinking. She wasn't going to allow herself to fear whatever disgusting dying men shared her ceiling. The soldiers led them to a holding cell without hesitation. KaLeah noticed that they obeyed her request as well. They put them into a cage, removed their bonds, and then locked them in with a turn of a key that was kept hanging on a wall near the staircase that led them out of the dungeon. KaLeah waited until the soldiers had left and then turned to her father. They both remained standing in the dirty cell. "Where have you been? What happened to you? What was that weapon? I found others in her house. Why were you hiding them? What have you done? Will the prince die?" He held up his hands, signaling her to stop her questions. She snapped her mouth shut, feeling scolded. He took a deep, labored breath and then looked for a place to sit, as if settling in for a long story. "I went looking for the ship that you found in the woods," he said. "What ship?" she asked. Her mind went back to that day in the woods when the ghost-like dragon with the translucent wings was digging something out of a grassy hill. Her own hands had dug and found something hard, something metal beneath the dirt. "Are you saying it was a boat buried in the woods? Why did you go looking for it?" "Not a boat, KaLeah, a ship, a warship, a ship that travels through air and space." "I don't understand," she said. She started pacing and biting at her nails. "There is no such thing." "It does not float on water like a boat, or traverse land like a carriage, KaLeah. It flies through the air." "That thing can fly through the air like a dragon?" she said a little too loudly. and then laughed, feeling ridiculous for even asking the question. She must have just misunderstood. Not just the air, but beyond the blue of our skies, beyond the black of space, all the way to Denlarak, Clegg said. The dead planet? The planet is not dead, but it is dying. KaLeah, please sit down. I have a lot to tell you. I was hoping that I never would need to tell you. Once your mother died, I had hoped that the past would just die with her, but it hasn't. Her father never mentioned her mother. It was more than rare. So she stopped pacing and brought herself down to the moist dirt, not caring if the muddy floor soiled her pants and tunic. Her heart was racing so much that she thought it was going to jump up and out of her throat. There is a civilization on Denlarak, Clegg began. People there live in large buildings made of metal. They have weapons such as the ones you found in our cellar. The gun that young man grabbed up there. Clegg nodded toward the ceiling. Will he die? She asked. Highly likely. The gun contained heater bullets designed to do irreparable damage. It is much worse than a sword. They should have left me and the gun alone. But we've been looking for you, KaLeah said. I've been looking for you. Well, you shouldn't have. I was hiding from the men who are hunting us. Who's hunting us? Denlarak soldiers. KaLeah, you were born here on this planet, but your mother and I were born on Denlarak. We lived there. You were in your mother's belly when we landed here. She was injured and didn't survive your birth. It is not an easy way to travel, and I regret that we did not wait, but we were trying to escape. Why? Why? What were you escaping from? KaLeah asked, not able to resist interrupting him. There was a long pause before he answered. He looked away toward a small puddle of water for a long time. From your father. Then he raised his eyes to meet hers. I raised you, but I'm not your actual father. Your mother was my friend. She disagreed with your father's decision to invade Naldash. He wanted to conquer and enslave its people. Your mother, Huntra, came here to warn the people. Once she died, I just couldn't see how anyone here would ever believe that we were from the dead planet. Their beliefs are archaic and superstitious. They would have killed us out of fear. So instead, I created a life for us here. I buried the ship in the woods where it crash landed. I built the house nearby so I could keep an eye on anyone going in and out from our village, just in case I had to make up a story or move the ship. After so many years, I never expected you to find it. Somehow, when you touched the ship, it activated a signal. Men, soldiers from Denlarak who have been hiding here among us, picked up the signal. When I got to the ship that night, they were there. They captured and interrogated me. I stole a gun from their camp and barely escaped with my life. I kept running. I didn't know where I was until the Bellarone soldiers picked me up. I think that these men have infiltrated the kingdoms and helped to start the war that the captain mentioned in the throne room, creating discord, chaos, and 3 divided kingdoms would make it much easier for Denlarak to invade. KaLeah's mind spun through everything he had just said. Clegg Trapper was not her actual father. What did that mean? She had another father on another planet that was not dead, but thriving and intent on war? She stood up, looking for some window. She needed to look at the dead planet, this Denlarak. She needed something to ground her back to her own reality, the reality she knew. There was no window in the dungeon. She closed her eyes and pictured the planet in her mind. Her mother, Clegg, and her real father had lived on the orb that sat in the sky with the moon and sun. It was all too much to take in at once. She turned and looked her father over. He was a large, muscular man with a round face and brown eyes. She looked nothing like him, and yet she just always assumed it was because she looked like her mother. But this was the man who raised her. This was her father. She felt as if her heart was shrinking into the shadows of the dungeon, pulling her away from him. "Did you love my mother?" she asked. "As a friend," Clegg answered. "But not romantically?" "No." "But you left your home, your planet, for her." "Yes. I believed in her. I was part of an underground movement against Lord Keldon, your father." "Lord?" "Dane Keldon. He is the Lord Dictator over Denlarak. There are no kingdoms." KaLeah resumed pacing. Everything she had ever known had been a lie. In times like this, when you feel the foundation fall out from beneath you, you turn to your family, to the ones you love for support, she thought to herself. "Do you love me?" KaLeah asked, looking out through the cell bars. "I do care for you greatly, KaLeah. You are like a daughter to me, and I hope that I have cared for you as your mother would have wished me to." Like a daughter, she repeated in her head, but not a real daughter, like a daughter. "I'm so sorry about all this, KaLeah. If you just hadn't found that ship, none of this would have happened." "I didn't find the ship," she said, still not looking at him. She stared into the flame of a candle on a wall beyond the bars, thinking back to that day in the woods. "A dragon spirit led me to it." Then she laughed, realizing how crazy that sounded. "Do you hear their voices calling to you in times of stress or conflict?" he asked, surprising her. She turned back around, struggling to focus on him in the dark after staring at the candlelight. "Yes? How how did you know that? I mean, I hear voices, but are you saying that I'm hearing dragon spirits?" He closed his eyes and leaned back against the stone wall. "Huntra, I am so sorry," he said. "I have been a blind fool all these years." He spoke as if KaLeah wasn't there. He took a deep breath and then reopened his eyes. "There is an ancient prophecy on Denlarak, a prophecy that the people in my rebellion believe in. They'll believe that a warrior will come. The dragons will call the warrior to finish the war that began and reunite the sister planets. Everyone hoped that your mother was the one. She was part of the rebellion and infiltrated the enemy right into the heart of the dictator. But we were wrong. KaLeah, if you have seen a phantom dragon, seen the ghost of the dragons that came before us, and if you hear them calling to you, then you are the only one who can save both planets." KaLeah stood there, looking down at the man who raised her, while water dripped on the stone and men called for help and food from other cells. She blinked her eyes a few times, trying to clear her vision, trying to clear her mind. "You do realize how crazy all of this sounds," she said. "Oh, yes. Imagine believing in myth and magic in a land of machines and metal. Superstition and religion are not as common on Denlarak as they are here on Naldash. People get from place to place in rolling or floating machines, work to create buildings that touch the clouds. They have made the air heavy and hard to breathe. The plants don't grow above the ground and water is polluted. That is why Keldon wants Naldash. He wants to keep it clean but have the land work to feed his planet. But you can change everything. You can protect this land." Clegg stood up and walked to KaLeah, He placed his hands on her shoulders and smiled at her in amazement for the first time in her life. She had never seen him look like a man with so much purpose before. He looked proud. "You are the one. This is your destiny." KaLeah knew that she should feel proud and happy that her father was finally seeing her, but he wasn't her father. He had fabricated an entire life. He had kept the true story of her mother from her. She didn't even know what her mother looked like because she had always been afraid to ask, afraid that it would make him sad or angry because of how much she had imagined that he loved her mother. But this man didn't even love her until this moment when he found out she could fulfill some crazy prophecy that he believed in. Of course, he also believed that the dead planet was living, boats could fly, and dragon spirits were talking to her. She shook him off her and stepped away. How could she believe all this now if he had lied to her for her entire life? All the trust she ever had for him, the respect and admiration, melted away. "You were always so hard on me." "I'm sorry, KaLeah. I didn't know what to do with a girl, a child that was not my own. I did the best I could. I did all I knew to. If I failed you, then that is something you will just have to forgive me for." Before she could think of a response, Captain Davin came running into the dungeon. "Favor KaLeah, Prince Bilex has died," he said. "Princess Amira has been placed on the throne until her father can return from war. She is requesting your presence." Hilip grabbed the key from the wall and released KaLeah. She didn't turn to look at her father, at Clegg Trapper, before Hilip led her up the stairs and out of the putrid air.